Hey everybody, this is Mr. White, and this is our AP European History Era 4 review. Today we're going to be covering 1914 through the present day. Topics today include World War I, interwar years, World War II, and the Cold War. So, we're going to get started. Make sure you like and subscribe. Oh, I can't even take myself seriously saying that. Okay, so what are our big trends we're going to be looking at today? So, today's big trends are really different than yesterday's. Yesterday, we were doing Era 3. And remember, Era 3 is this 100-year period in the 1800s where Europe is going from how they used to be to how kind of they are now, right? It's that idea of go from these monarchist states, these not very industrialized societies, right? These societies that look nothing like the societies we have today, to 1913, 1914, when there's cars on the streets, there's electric lights, there's modern nationalist nation states, right? So we have all of those changes in states happen throughout the 1800s. So by 1914, we have a world that doesn't look too distant than the world we have today. We have modern nation states, modern technology, modern industrialism. So today we're going to watch that system fall apart. Today we start with our conflict and crisis section on World War I and World War II, and then we'll also get into this idea of, after all of this, Europe's role in the world is further reduced through the Cold War. We're going to look at how modernity, which had really defined the period of time up to World War I, increasingly becomes under attack in the 1920s, and that those attacks continue through the 1950s, 60s, and even modern day. Generally, nowadays, there's a lot of questioning of institutions and ideologies that never used to be there, really, in the 1800s and even in the early 1900s. And lastly, we'll talk about how a lot of competing ideologies are still reshaping Europe to this day. The fight between capitalism and communism is one, and we'll also have some time to talk about feminism and immigration, which are some other big forces that have been reshaping Europe today. So let's get into it. We can't start this unit with anything other than the Great War. I mean, this is the defining, breaking moment where suddenly we go from Era 3 to Era 4. This is the most clear split of any of the eras or any of the periods of AP Euro. This is the most obvious moment where it makes sense to start a new period. World War I is new and strange and a much different kind of war than the world's used to seeing. There's modern equipment like never before. There's tanks, there's airplanes, there's battleships, there's machine guns, there's massive new long-range artillery. It's a world war, right? I mean, the 7 Years' War is kind of a world war, but not like this. This involves battlefields in 3 different continents, and over 20 million people die. At the time, that's about 1% of world population. Okay, that's my cat. My cat's going to join this production, apparently. Okay. So yeah, get excited for that. It's going to happen. So what were the main causes of the Great War? So main causes of the Great War include things like militarism, which is the arms buildup. We have alliances that kind of reshape Europe. Imperialism, which upsets the balance of power. And nationalism, which gives countries the kind of confidence and the lack of kind of, how much damage this could do. When I say lack of, what I mean is the lack of foresight. Oh my God, lack of foresight as to how much damage all this war could do. So, militarism might be things, we could think of things like the naval arms race between Germany and Britain. Alliances, think about how those alliances pulled a whole bunch of countries into the war, right? Like the whole idea that why is it that Austria invading Serbia pulls in Germany, then pulls in Russia, then pulls in France, then pulls in Belgium and Britain. And imperialism and nationalism help give kind of motives to begin the fight in the first place. So how does this start, right? We need a spark to light this fire. We can think of the spark, right, as the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. The war begins largely as a war between Austria and Serbia, and Germany gets pulled into the war as Austria's friend, but Germany also was sort of expecting this war. They had been drafting battle plans for this war, and they knew that this was their moment to kind of secure the future of German hegemony in Europe. And so their plan was called the Schlieffen plan, right? They want to knock out France first so they can turn their attention to their bigger foe, Russia. The plan fails, which turns the Western Front into a total stalemate. And militaries that had been used to horses and slow bolt-action rifles and shorter-range artillery without any machine guns are very confused on how to deal with all of these new technologies, right? They don't know how to break the stalemate because a lot of these new technologies give the onus to the defender, not the offense, right? Machine guns, barbed wire, big artillery, make it really easy to defend, and tanks and airplanes aren't really that effective yet. They're not that useful at breaking these defenses down. So what we get is that trench warfare that just so obviously defines, right, your World War I. We also have imperialism being a big factor in the war. Every country will have colonial troops to help with the war effort. Now, the colonies often did not provide a whole lot of industrial support. Like, it's not like they were providing ammunition. They're not providing a whole lot of money. The biggest thing they're providing is manpower. And manpower is a really big deal for some of these countries. Especially, I mean, not really maybe Germany, that has a lot of population and their African colonies are relatively small. But a big one is Britain. Britain uses a lot of Indian troops. For example, Britain relies heavily on its Indian troops during the Gallipoli campaign, as well as some other campaigns on the Western Front. We also see that there is a lot of Arab troops that are going to assist the Allies in taking down the Ottoman Empire, who later joins the Central Powers. And the kind of big takeaways from how the war is fought is that it's just brutal and awful, and people don't like it. This is kind of some of the first documented signs of shell shock, or PTSD, come from World War I. Historians and veterans of the war notice that this is the first war that kind of introduces the idea of industrialized death, right? World War I changed the life of words and images and art radically and forever. Brought our culture into the age of mass-produced, industrialized death, right? Where death becomes basically mechanical and it becomes consistent and common, and soldiers just have to get used to just seeing large-scale death and destruction all the time because of how advanced war technology has gotten. So even before the war really ends, people are already drafting up their kind of plans to bring an end to the war, right? They're drafting their peace treaties, their ideas, because this is always how things have been done in Europe. This was to be expected. After Westphalia and after the Napoleonic Wars, there were big peace conferences where people redrew maps of Europe, and so people were expecting this after World War I. They're planning for it. So we have like Woodrow Wilson with his 14 points, his idea of a peace without victory. And when they all sit down at Versailles, once Germany signs an armistice, and kind of thanks to a variety of factors, one of which is the more important factor of American troops kind of arriving and ensuring that Germany's not going to be able to win the long fight. Germany signs this armistice, this ceasefire, and then everyone gets together in Versailles to settle on a peace treaty. But of these four big figures at Versailles, you'll notice that none of them are German. On the far left, we have David Lloyd George of Britain. Just to his right is Vittorio Emanuele III, or Vittorio Emanuele Orlando. Is he the third? I think he's the third. I might be wrong. He is the Italian Prime Minister. Then we have Georges Clemenceau, who might be the Lorax. And then on the far right, we have Woodrow Wilson. I think he's the Lorax. I don't really know how he could not be with such a mustache. So the negotiations are problematic because Germany's not there. Austria's not there. And it seems to be a very vindictive peace conference. Clemenceau, leader of the French, really takes control of the negotiations and redraws Europe much to the favor of France and much to the frustration of Austria and Germany. People blame Germany for the war. They say it's German militarism, German nationalism, German grievances with the imperialist order that caused the war. And for that reason, they're the ones that suffer the largest territorial losses. There are some other things to keep track of, right, like the Ottoman Empire breaking apart, turning into mandates, and notice that there's no German mandates, they're just French and British mandates. Remember, those mandates are kind of like colonies, but they're supposed to eventually get their freedom. they don't get their freedom until after World War II. So in the meantime, they're kind of just colonies. And the final piece of all the puzzle here is they craft the League of Nations, which is supposed to ensure peace in the future. But the League of Nations is weak. It lacks a real military. It depends a lot on mutual agreement in a time of rising nationalism. And the League becomes more of an advisory council as things move on. It really struggles to enforce disarmament and diplomacy. Because of how vindictive the conference in Vienna, the Congress at Versailles is, and by the way, that's very different than like Vienna or Westphalia, right? Those two conferences were not vindictive in the same way that Versailles was. Ferdinand Foch, who's the Supreme Allied Commander, declares that this is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. And he makes this statement in August 1919. I believe it was August 1st, 1919. So he's pretty much just 1 month off of his prediction, because 20 years and 1 month later, Germany invades Poland. Meanwhile, in the background of all this, remember, Russia actually ended up being the weaker opponent, not France, for Germany in World War I. And so because they lost and they were forced to sign a treaty that ceded lots of land over to Germany, there was a lot of anger over in Russia over the way things were being done. Combine that with a rising Bolshevik movement and rising socialist sentiments, with anger about how the war was going, and the fact that Lenin was in Germany and could easily be snuck back into Russia by Germany, it made sense for a revolution to break out in Russia, which it did. What's interesting, though, is in 1917, when the February Revolution breaks out in Russia, yeah, they overthrow the Tsar, but the new government they put into place is not Bolshevik immediately. Actually, a kind of moderate left-wing government comes into power, the provisional government run by Alexander Kerensky, and it won't be until actually October that Russia turns into a full communist state. So there's about 8 months there where there is actually going to be a provisional democratic government in charge and not a communist government in charge. So, in the interwar years, what we have is kind of not a pretty picture. Russia falls to communism, France is blown up by German artillery, casualties are really high all across Europe, countries have been thoroughly mobilized, young people have been destroyed, Russia's gone full communism, totally going against kind of modern liberal nationalist capitalism. And a weird after effect out of all this is because of all the men being nationalized for the war effort, women are forced to kind of do all the industrial work at home in a lot of these countries. And for that reason, it's actually women who are some of the biggest victors of World War I. They end up getting their right to vote, in part because of like a thank you for how much they do during the war. They kind of, previously the women's suffrage movement was struggling to kind of break through into the mainstream, and the World War I really like pushes it over the top. It's like Emmeline Pankhurst and others help get it to kind of like a position where people are aware of it and people are like thinking about it, but to get the majority of people behind it takes World War I and people realizing how crucial women were to the war effort. So, also after World War I, we see people start to kind of lose confidence in modernity. A greatest example of this is probably Dadaism. This ridiculous art movement where people are almost memeing, right? They're attacking modern art. You have Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain over there on the left. It's a urinal. The Mona Lisa with a mustache. You have Surrealism, which is trying to show you kind of the dream-like irrational state that is human consciousness and the fragility of human thought. We have Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory, for example, here. And the interwar years are also defined not just by a loss of faith in modernity, because that's expressed in art and casualties and from the war and all that. And there's also like a crisis of money. I mean, it's just hard times. The Great Depression hits in 1929, making the 1930s kind of a decade of poverty, right? The Great Depression largely has its roots actually in America, But some of those roots are linked to Europe, right? Like the whole foreign debts and repayment system called the Dawes Plan, and later it was amended into the Young Plan. But this system is really defining for Europe, especially Germany. I can explain the system quickly. I wish I had made an infographic for us, but in simple, it's a triangle, right? We have America loans money to Britain and France to pay for armaments. Okay. Then Britain and France, after the war's over, ask for money from Germany for reparations. Okay. Now this makes sense for Britain and France because they want reparations from Germany because they have debts they need to pay for America for all the military armaments they bought. Now Germany's in trouble. Germany's like, we don't got cash. And America realizes that Germany is actually one of its largest trading partners in the world. A lot of American goods are actually made in Germany. And they realize that Germany is also a big market for them, so it makes sense to keep the German economy alive and well. So America actually extends an offer to Germany. They'll provide loans to Germany under the condition that a portion of the loans they provide are used to pay back reparations. This works double for America because once Germany pays back reparations, America also gets payment back on those arms it sold to Britain and France. So basically, it's like a triangle that helps circle everyone's debt out and slowly kind of greases the wheels of the economy and keeps capital flowing. If you remember from econ, capital flowing is always a good thing. You want capital to move, right? When capital sits still, it's not doing anything. And so by getting capital flowing through this debts and repayment system, the world economy was working. The problem with that system is it makes everyone very dependent upon one another. So when all these other things come into play, that dependency is going to hit Germany especially really hard. So the reason why that really breaks out in the first place is because overproduction in agriculture and manufacturing, rising economic inequality and reckless consumer spending, and a stock market bubble. The overproduction, reckless consumer spending, and poor regulations on people's abilities to take loans to put money on the stock market all contribute to the stock market bubble, and bubbles inherently will burst, right? The whole reason a bubble happens is because people have too much faith in a market, and when they inevitably figure out that they're not logical and that they've placed too much faith in the stock market, the bubble bursts. And when the bubble bursts, the American economy comes down with it because America has a poor banking structure and cannot absorb a gigantic stock market crash. Then the Great Depression is worsened by protectionist and nationalist trade policies that spread through the world like wildfire. So a lot of leaders are going to promise to kind of fix their countries in this troubled time. Stalin had it easiest in the sense that he was already in power, and he basically did not participate in the world economy. And so his job was to consolidate power and prove that his system was the best. Mussolini decided that he needed to prove that Italy could be strong through nationalism. Mussolini actually takes control 10 years before the Great Depression, or 8 years before the Great Depression, and he encourages Italians to stick together through his fascist movement, which really stressed nationalism, combat, and was sort of just an anti-liberal movement. Hitler sort of copies Mussolini's fascism, but really adds in a very racist side to it that helps unify the German people behind it. So fascism is this highly right-wing nationalist movement. It's conservative in nature. It usually embraces religion. It usually embraces traditional social structures. For example, fascism usually recognizes the very different roles of men and women. And it's also marked by totalitarianism, of course. This puts the nation in charge of everyone else. And it really makes individual rights and freedoms less important than the success of the nation. So Mussolini was famous for, ending elections and just basically making himself a dictator because that was his plan. The left-wing kind of version of totalitarianism is communism. And communism doesn't necessarily have to be totalitarian, but in pretty much all cases it is. And this is because communism tries to make sure that there's no private property and that property is perfectly redistributed amongst the people. But to do that, the government kind of needs to do it. And so with the government owning the means of production, it kind of becomes an all-powerful entity, and the ability then for the government to become corrupt is pretty obvious. So let's start with Stalin, actually. You see, Stalin, when he is first kind of appointed the successor to the Soviet Union by Lenin, after Lenin dies in 1924, he's actually doesn't have a really firm grasp of the party. He's getting a lot of left-wing criticism, for example, from Trotsky. He's got to expel him in 27. He sides with this guy, Bukharin, right-wing communist leader. However, to get rid of Bukharin and his followers, Stalin has to purge them. They have to go by force. And so Stalin basically uses his party machine and his basically goons, if you will, to assassinate them or threaten them into submission. And once he has control of the country by 1928, he embarks on the first of many 5-year plans. So this is called centralized economic planning, right? It's when the government lays out what will be done. The government decides the supply, the demand, the price, everything, right? The idea is to mobilize and control the economy as if a country is at war. And to make sure that this program works with the least amount of resistance, Stalin really leveraged existing social tensions in Russia. Remember, Lenin is not anti-peasant, right? Lenin was a big believer in pulling the peasants into the revolution, right? Pull in the peasant farmers. So things that Lenin did was he was actually allow private property and decentralized control of agriculture because it often helped farm workers. Stalin, though, knows that the city population, the urban population, is suspicious of farm workers, so he collectivized peasants and would often blame peasants if the 5-year plan struggled. He basically pitted his urban laborers against what he called bourgeois peasants, if that makes any sense. And part of the reason why so many people die during the 5-year plan is actually because of the famines happening out in the countryside, like in the Ukraine. Meanwhile, over in Germany, we have this Austrian art school reject, joins up with the Bavarian army, co-founds the Nazi party, tries to overthrow the government because he thought with all the hyperinflation going on in Germany in the early 20s, people would be down to have a new leader, and the putsch doesn't work. Actually, what's interesting is Germans were actually willing to give the world economy and the DAS plan and the foreign debts and repayments plan a try. You see, the DAS plan didn't really put into effect until 1924 as a way to deal with kind of this inflationary and reparations crisis. So we can actually see that because of the plan's success, if you look here, from 1924 to 1928, Hitler actually loses support, despite, you know, the whole hoopla of him being thrown in prison and publishing Mein Kampf. But Hitler the whole time says this whole international system will never work. It'll never work. He says it's dumb. He says it's run by all these capitalist Jews in the West and in America and Britain, and they're conspiring against us. And Germans don't believe any of this because they kind of think a lot of it is probably nonsense. So when the Great Depression happens, for totally separate reasons, Hitler can basically be like, aha, I told you so. And although he wasn't right, there was no Jewish conspiracy to, you know, hurt Germany, it does decrease people's confidence in the capitalist world trade system. And for that reason, people turn to the Nazis. And because of Hitler's leadership, he's able to really pull party membership up, all the way up to about a high of 37% in 1932. Just so people are aware, the March 1933 election is only a partially free election. There's a lot of voter intimidation that happened during that election. It's very likely that German support at a real level was never much higher than 37%. Meanwhile, in Britain and France, you might be wondering, why are they not, you know, embarking on these kind of crazy, you know, plans? And remember, they're the victors of the war. People have a little bit more confidence in the institutions over there. And their institutions, although people have more confidence in them, they don't necessarily have more confidence in war or militarization or worrying about what's even happening in foreign countries. They're more worried about what's happening in their own country. So like when Britain suffers an economic disaster, they just want to make a quick buck and recover the economy as soon as possible, cutting all ties from Germany, sanctioning Germany, doing all these things that might actually put pressure on, you know, these rising fascist powers in Italy and Germany isn't always good economics for Britain. Besides, Britain has its own fascist movement, right? They have to deal with anti-fascist riots in their own country. A kind of left-wing coalition wins election in France, putting radical socialists and Marxists in charge. And they don't really have a clear policy on the rising fascist and communist powers elsewhere in Europe. They're too busy dealing with their own unemployment issues and their own radicals within their own party. So because Britain and France sort of have all this political instability in the 1920s and 30s, they're not really equipped to deal with all this rising aggression that leads to World War II. So the road to World War II is almost exclusively, at least in Europe, done by Germany. If the road to World War I is very loose and ideological, and it kind of comes out of like one snap event, and then all these alliances get triggered, and it's more of everyone's fault than everyone likes to admit, the road to World War II is 100% Germany's fault. Now, there are other powers that are instigators. For example, Italy is an instigator, and Japan starts World War II over in Asia. So like Japan with their co-prosperity sphere, their taking of Manchuria, and their war on China that starts in 1937. Japan, all the war that happens in Asia, that's on Japan, right? They definitely start that conflict with their own nationalist aggression. Italy doesn't really start the war in Europe, but they definitely get the ball rolling on using military force. For example, their invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 proves that the League of Nations was seriously incapable of imposing deep economic sanctions on an aggressor nation. In fact, the only thing that they ban from selling to Italy is guns, which Italy has plenty of. They don't ban the sale of oil, which would have actually been a real problem for the Italian military. And so when Germany sees all this, and they see kind of these really soft, weak responses to militarization and aggression, that's when they're much more willing to do things like withdraw from the League of Nations, rearm, test the limits of international regulatory agencies, remilitarize the Rhineland in 1936, and nowadays, as historians, we're like, why didn't people see this coming? You know, why didn't people look at Germany doing all this and be like, oh my God, you're breaking the Treaty of Versailles, stop it. Well, the problem is everyone else is sort of breaking it a little bit too. The League of Nations doesn't really have the power to do anything. Britain and France don't want to commit militarily, and it just seems like the democratic response is kind of weak and floundering. Meanwhile, fascists look kind of scary. I mean, the Rome-Berlin Axis announced in 1936 makes people realize that, you know, there's perhaps a big threat here. And just going to war with Germany in 36 doesn't seem very feasible for Britain or France. Their militaries aren't mobilized. Their opponents might be just as ready to fight as they are. Also, what about communism, right? I mean, these guys are acting as a bulwark to communism in a weird way. They even signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. And communism is definitely a fear that Britain and America especially have. And so perhaps in a weird way, they could even be turned into allies against maybe the inevitable war that might happen between the USSR and the West. So all of this comes to a head in the Spanish Civil War, right? The Spanish Civil War is really where we see the fascists and kind of socialist or pseudo-communists kind of play out their frustrations. And the war turns into one between kind of this Republican socialist side, this fascist side, and it quickly goes into the favor of the fascists. And this is because the fascists are willing to commit more support, specifically in terms of troops, tanks, and airplanes. And this is where Hitler really gets to try out his blitzkrieg techniques. This makes Hitler so confident in his military that he's not afraid to start really seizing territory, like with the Anschluss and kind of forcing Austrians to vote on joining Germany and intimidating them with force. And eventually, he even threatens Czechoslovakia. They have to give up their Sudetenland to him. And at first, no one is like, everyone in Europe's like, we can't do this, right? We can't give up the Sudetenland to Germany. But because of how powerful the German military has gotten by 1938 and how much more mobilized and ready to fight it is than everyone else, European leaders are forced to go on this strategy of appeasement. The idea is mostly to buy time. So, for example, Neville Chamberlain hands off the Sudetenland to Germany. And he says, my good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Go home and get a nice, quiet sleep. And Neville Chamberlain, although it's probably true that he wanted to buy time, it's hard not to think of him as the fool here, right? I mean, clearly this is not going to satiate Germany. And in fact, pretty soon after this, they proceed to seize the rest of Czechoslovakia. And Poland is the line in the sand. Poland does indeed have a diplomatic guarantee from both France and Great Britain that if Poland is invaded, they will go to war with Germany. They will put a stop to this. And Poland has a pretty big military of its own. So when Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declare war, and World War II is on. Poland falls relatively quickly, in part because Russia helps break Poland in half. They invade from the other side a few weeks later. So Germany knows that the big enemy is going to be France. And so Germany, wanting revenge from World War I, has a plan to beat France. But France sees it coming, right? They build the Maginot Line, strong defenses on their borders with Germany. They don't expect German tanks to kind of roll across Belgium as quickly as they do. And after France falls, Britain's really the only person left in Europe defending against Germany. At this point in time, Germany signs the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, saying that there will not be aggressive hostilities between Germany and the USSR, and Britain stands alone in this war against Germany. The war is almost entirely fought through the air and results in lots of civilian casualties in large cities like London. Because of the fact that the British are largely able to repel the German Luftwaffe, or the Air Force, Germans are forced to turn their attention somewhere else in Europe because they can't invade by sea. They don't really have much of a navy compared to Britain. So they decide to invade Russia, a pretty massive blunder in retrospect, right? But at the time, I mean, he almost wins, Hitler does. He gets real darn close to Moscow by winter of 1941. And in the summer of 1942, he keeps seeing a bunch of victories as his army marches closer to the oil fields in Baku, kind of marching through all of southern Russia. I mean, he just totally moves through Ukraine, I think in like a month or something. So eventually, as the war drags on, and there's more and more time for these larger nations like the USSR and America to mobilize, and by the way, America does get brought in with Pearl Harbor, things start to turn south for Germany. For example, the war in North Africa is a pretty straightforward victory for the Allies, and they're able to then jump in and invade Italy, opening up a new front in Europe. Mussolini will eventually be caught and hung by the Italian people. And over in Russia, for example, Stalingrad shows that the Russians are not really a weak enemy after all, right? They are able to retaliate and surround and cut off an entire German army and devastate them. Pretty much after Stalingrad, it's a bunch of defeats for Germany. I mean, yeah, there's a few victories. There's the Second Battle of Kharkov, and there's the Battle of Kursk, which are sort of more of a stalemate. But after that, there's a lot of defeats. And for the most part, the USSR swaps the momentum over to their side. So, couple that with D-Day and America and Britain invading and recapturing France, you get a Germany that falls apart. But when Russians, Americans, Brits, and the French enter into Germany, they realize something has been happening in Germany. Now, everyone knew Hitler was an anti-Semite. That was no surprise. I mean, even in the 1930s, he had been kind of defining Jews, requiring them to wear the Star of Israel, forcing his citizens to kind of watch anti-Jewish propaganda, stealing property from them, banning their businesses, revoking businesses' licenses, asking German businesses to fire Jewish workers. Everyone knew this stuff was going on in the 1930s. But when Russians enter into Poland and when Americans enter into Germany, they find that Germany goes to new heights. First of all, I forgot to mention Kristallnacht. Oh, yeah. And Kristallnacht is a great example of expropriation action, right? The Night of Broken Glass, the Western world knew about through newspapers and coverage of this night where it was basically legally okay to terrorize and pillage Jewish businesses. So everyone knew this was happening. The concentration is something that kind of begins as war breaks out in 1939. And this is the strategy of removing Jews from German city centers into their own little areas called ghettos. And at this point, this is still not something the world has never seen before, but this is like a new level of escalation that happens after the war starts. I mean, it's not unheard of for people to live in their own kind of racial or ethnic ghettos. I mean, come on, South Africa did it for 50 years after World War II. But what a lot of people don't realize, especially people within Germany and Jews within Germany in the late 30s, early 40s, is that these ghettos and these concentration camps serve a deeper, darker purpose. Eventually, these camps were set up to actually be extermination camps. And at the Wannsee Conference, the Germans decide on the final solution in early 1942. From there on out, they're basically building death camps designed to exterminate as many Jews as they can. This is truly because the Germans truly believed in their racist ideology. I mean, Hitler truly believed that Jews posed an existential threat to Germany and German identity. He really believed that killing the Jews was absolutely necessary to the safety and security of his state. It sounds crazy to us. I mean, how could anyone think of something so dumb and racist and awful? But that really was his conviction, which is why this was able to happen, right? Although the Jews were used as a scapegoat, there also was an earnest belief by the high Nazi officials that this was supposedly a good thing. They bought into this racist ideology 100%. And this is how you get the death of over 6 million Jews in some of these extremely deadly death camps. I mean, Auschwitz-Birkenau killed over 1 million people. Belchek, this famous camp in southern Poland, killed about 500,000 people. And the survivor count, last time I checked, is under 10 or something. This is because Belchek was never actually liberated. The camp was shut down because they had killed all the people they needed to kill. Killing people was also heavily industrialized. Big businesses that, by the way, were never fully nationalized and, got to make profits during the war, sold fertilizers and other kinds of poisons to the German regime like Zyklon B. And they would often take from the victims like gold fillings and any merchandise they had to help kind of fund the German war effort. So the images are terrifying all on their own. Yeah, and they get punished, right? Nuremberg war trials put a lot of these guys on trial, send quite a few of them to death, and firmly reject the Nazi argument that, the commanders are only following orders. So there is some justice, but never enough. So by the end of World War II, it's all about what are we going to do after the war. I mean, it's kind of inevitable by 44 and 45 that Germany's falling. It's just to who and how are they going to fall. So in 1945, I believe it's August 1945. I might be wrong on that. Maybe it's September. Anyways, by 1945, after Germany is surrendered, Western leaders like Clement Attlee and the American President Truman meet up with Stalin in Potsdam, and they decide to start dividing Germany into different sectors or zones. And there they promised that Eastern European governments should determine their own systems of government. They shouldn't have communism forced upon them, for example. So when it's time for the yearly checkup, if you will, Winston Churchill looks around Eastern Europe in 46 and is like, they didn't follow through with that. They broke that promise. They forced communism down the throats of Eastern Europe. And as early even as 46, we can start to see that East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland are all kind of forced into these communist governments, and Western Europe is now democratic capitalist. There's this big deal over Berlin because it's in East Germany, but the city's divided into two sides. So we're breaking into Cold War now, right? I mean, notice that each of these events almost leads into the next, like, fluidly. I mean, this period of history is so much more fluid than previous eras of history because of how much more globalized the world has gotten. The world is more on the same page than ever before, especially Europe. Cold War, as we know, is defined by the arms race, space race, the race for influence, trying to make nations capitalist or communist. All those third world countries, except for Greenland. Why does this one image have Greenland as a third world country? I don't know. They're owned by Denmark. The idea is to turn all these third world countries into possible allies of communism or capitalism. And this is largely because of a core ideological difference, right, between capitalism and communism. I mean, how different your government and your society has to be depending on which of these two your government endorses. And we see the fights about communism versus capitalism start playing out in Europe. Think things like the blockade of Berlin, the Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, NATO. All of this has a very European focus, right? And the Eastern Europe is kind of secured by the USSR with things like Cominform, Comecon, and the Warsaw Pact. But eventually, as the Cold War drags on, it starts to move more out of Europe, especially by the 60s and 70s. We start to see a lot more movements out of Europe. And this is largely because the rest of the world had always been colonized by Europe. Now, because of decolonization in places like India and in Indonesia, and as well as decolonization in the Middle East, decolonization in Africa, we see that there's more opportunities for Cold War proxy battles to break out. I mean, there would be no Suez Crisis of 1956 if Egypt hadn't been decolonized by the British. So this race for influence only happens in part because of the totally separate but simultaneous force of decolonization. I mean, remember, decolonization has nothing to do with the Cold War from a very, theoretical or ideological basis, right? I mean, decolonization is because these people of these places want their own independent nations. That has nothing to do with capitalism or communism. So for a lot of these places like Egypt, Algeria, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Iran, to them this is a matter of national sovereignty, of self-determination. But for America and Russia, oftentimes it gets interpreted as, okay, well, then are you capitalist or are you communist? Take your pick, because that's more important than apparently your own sovereignty. This is really clear in places like Algeria, where France is so hell-bent on kind of cracking down on Algeria and keeping control of Algeria, that Algeria drifts into socialism as a way of fighting back against France. The same thing happens really in Vietnam, right? Ho Chi Minh associates socialism with decolonization, or communism with decolonization, because it's Western capitalist Europe that has this history of imperialism, not Eastern Europe. Eventually, these conflicts almost erupt into nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and eventually both sides kind of move into this détente in the 1970s. This is where we start to see Europe working more with one another. This is when the EU, for example, grows to include lots of Southern Europe in the 70s and 80s. And we're seeing that as international attention moves away from Europe, Europe kind of bands together to remain relevant. A lot of this kind of comes to a head with the 1980s, right, with Gorbachev. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy is failing. Gorbachev tries perestroika, he tries glasnost, he tries to restructure his economy, allow for more capitalism, allow for some, for example, decentralization of the state economy and even some instances of private ownership of businesses. Glasnost opens up the press to Western media more. It allows for more critique of the Soviet regime. And because of all this more openness and experimentation, and now a lack of wanting to use military force to keep people in check, we see that Russia and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc becomes much more unstable. Things start to fall apart, for example, in Poland with the Solidarity movement, and it spreads to places like Yugoslavia and Hungary, right? Poland kicks it off in 1989 when they take a vote, and Gorbachev refuses to send in tanks and troops and enforce the Brezhnev Doctrine. We see it in Hungary the next month, then in East Germany, then in Yugoslavia, and then finally the Soviet Union itself breaks apart, and we get the modern-day states of like Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. So, as some review of since 1945, there's some things we've skipped over. Obviously, I've really focused on politics, right? I'll be honest, I've sort of focused on it maybe too much. So definitely keep in the back of your head like those 1960s revolts that I'd never really mentioned. Think about things like the baby boom. Think about hippies. Think about declining birth rates because of the pill. Think about counterculture. Think about immigrants and how crucial they were to help rebuild the economies of Europe. Think about feminism and the role it's played in reshaping European identities. Think about Islam and how this is this new kind of disruptor to the European identity. And last but not least, don't forget to address environmentalism as you study, and how that's become an increasing force in Europe. Sorry I didn't have the time in detail to get into all these things, but I'm approaching 45 minutes and my battery is getting low, so we're going to end actually on the EU. Again, politics. So we can see where my focus lies. So why did Europe sounds like churro. Why did Europe choose integration? Remember, this is a gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts really with the European coal and steel community, and it kind of speeds up with the formation of the EEC in 1957. The goal here is to kind of create Western European cooperation. And it won't be until really the fall of the Soviet Union that it expands into the modern day EU as a way to kind of keep Europe relevant in an era where America is the only remaining superpower, right? Now that there's no Soviet Union, America's not going to necessarily support Europe the same way they did before, and they need to be one united multinational or supranational state to really remain relevant in the modern economy. So, our takeaway: 2 world wars and a Cold War pretty much unseats Europe as the center of world affairs, and to this day, the EU is trying to kind of keep Europe relevant. Without imperialism, without being necessarily the center of all world trade and industry, it doesn't seem like Europe is the way it used to be. It doesn't seem like Europe is as important as it used to be. And it's up to you to decide if that's a good or a bad thing. The EU, though, is going to keep trying. So, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. I gotta go. Battery's about to die, so I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.